When I penned Utopia in my study at Chelsea, little did I imagine that 5 centuries later, people would still struggle with the same fundamental question: how do we build a society that serves human flourishing rather than mere accumulation? We witness today what I observed in my own time: brilliant minds designing systems that enrich the few while impoverishing the many, treating symptoms while ignoring the disease of disordered priorities. Yet here lies the paradox that should give us hope. The very problems that seem most modern were already solved in principle by communities that understood a simple truth: that material abundance without moral purpose creates spiritual poverty, while shared purpose with modest means can create genuine prosperity. The island of Utopia I described was not fantasy, but blueprint. Not perfection, but direction. Today, I invite you to decode what that blueprint reveals about the Christian society we could still build. Chapter 1: The Foundation: Why Private Property Fails Human Nature. In Utopia, I wrote that, where money is the measure of everything, it is hardly possible for the Commonwealth to be just or prosperous. This was not the sentiment of a naive idealist, but the observation of a man who spent decades in law courts, witnessed the machinations of royal politics, and saw how the pursuit of private wealth corrupted even well-intentioned souls. The fundamental error of societies organized around private accumulation is not that they reward effort. Indeed, virtue deserves recognition, but that they confuse possession with prosperity, having with being. When land becomes commodity rather than stewardship, when housing becomes investment rather than shelter, when education becomes product rather than formation, we create systems that work against human nature rather than with it. Consider how this manifests in your contemporary American context. You have unprecedented material abundance, yet rising rates of anxiety, depression, and social fragmentation. Your young people achieve academic and professional success yet struggle to find meaning. Your elderly accumulate wealth yet lack community. This is not accidental. It is the inevitable result of organizing society around the principle that individual acquisition serves collective good. The Utopians understood what classical philosophy and Christian teaching both affirm: humans are social beings who find fulfillment through relationship and contribution, not possession and consumption. Their economic system reflected this understanding. Labor was distributed according to ability and inclination, with everyone contributing according to their gifts while receiving according to their needs. This was not enforced equality. The Utopians recognized differences in talent, inclination, and circumstance. Rather, it was principled inequality. Those blessed with greater abilities had greater obligations to serve the common good. The brilliant scholar owed his learning to the community that freed him from manual labor. The gifted administrator owed his position to those who entrusted him with authority. What made this system work was not external compulsion but internal transformation. The Utopians cultivated virtues that made such cooperation natural rather than forced. They understood that you cannot build a just society with unjust hearts, nor create generous communities with selfish individuals. The economic structure of Utopia was possible only because it rested on a foundation of character formation that began in childhood and continued through adulthood. This reveals why attempts to create equitable societies through redistribution alone inevitably fail. External structures cannot overcome internal disorders. Laws cannot substitute for love. Regulations cannot replace virtue. The Christian society we could build requires not just new policies, but renewed people, individuals formed in the understanding that their highest dignity comes through service, their greatest security through community, their deepest satisfaction through contribution to something greater than themselves. Chapter 2: Education as Formation: Creating Citizens, Not Consumers. The Utopians approached education with a principle that would revolutionize your contemporary American educational system. Learning serves character formation first, practical skills second. Not because practical skills are unimportant. The Utopians were remarkably advanced in agriculture, medicine, and craftsmanship, but because knowledge without virtue becomes dangerous, while virtue with modest knowledge can accomplish great good. In my dialogue with Raphael, I described how utopian children learn through a curriculum that integrated intellectual development with moral formation, practical skills with philosophical reflection, individual excellence with social responsibility. Every citizen learned a trade, ensuring that none looked down upon manual labor, while those showing intellectual gifts received advanced education that deepened rather than separated them from their community obligations. This stands in stark contrast to educational systems that treat students as consumers purchasing credentials, or as human resources being prepared for economic productivity. When education becomes merely vocational training, it produces workers but not citizens, specialists but not human beings, individuals capable of earning but not of living. The crisis in American education reflects this fundamental confusion about purpose. You debate endlessly about funding, testing, curriculum, and administration while ignoring the deeper question: what kind of people are we trying to form? If the goal is merely economic competitiveness, then education becomes indoctrination into materialism. If the goal is individual self-actualization, then education becomes therapy. If the goal is ideological conformity, then education becomes propaganda. The utopian approach suggests a different path: education as humanization. This means teaching young people not just how to make a living, but how to live, not just how to compete, but how to cooperate, not just how to succeed individually, but how to contribute collectively. It means integrating intellectual rigor with moral formation, classical learning with practical skills, individual development with social responsibility. Such formation would produce citizens capable of the virtues necessary for a just society: prudence to discern truth from falsehood, justice to give each person their due, fortitude to persevere in difficulty, temperance to order desires according to reason. These are not merely personal virtues, they are social necessities, the character traits without which no political system can function justly. The utopians understood that democracy, properly conceived, requires more virtue from citizens than any other form of government. Monarchy can function with one virtuous ruler and compliant subjects. Aristocracy needs only virtue among the elite. But democracy requires virtue distributed throughout the populace, because every citizen shares in governance through their votes, voices, and voluntary associations. This is why the Christian society we could build must begin with educational reform that prioritizes character formation. Not character as mere niceness or compliance, but character as the developed capacity to choose good over evil, truth over falsehood, service over selfishness, even when such choices require sacrifice. The practical implementation would involve schools that teach classical literature not for cultural literacy but for moral imagination, history not for national pride but for prudential wisdom, science not for technological mastery but for wonder at creation, mathematics not for economic utility but for intellectual discipline. Every subject becomes a means of formation when approached with the understanding that education serves human flourishing rather than mere human productivity. Chapter 3: Work as Vocation, Dignity Through Service, Not Status. In Utopia, I described a society where the 6-hour workday provided abundance for all while leaving time for intellectual pursuits, family life, and civic engagement. This was not wishful thinking but careful calculation based on a profound insight. Most human labor in complex societies serves artificial needs created by disordered desires rather than genuine human necessities. The utopians eliminated entire categories of what we might call luxury production, ornate clothing, excessive ornamentation, competitive consumption, not because they opposed beauty or comfort, but because they recognized that much of what societies call economic activity actually diminishes rather than enhances human well-being. When everyone dresses simply but well, no one suffers from either want or envy of clothing. When homes are comfortable but modest, No one lacks shelter while others live in palaces. This principle challenges the foundational assumption of modern economic theory, that endless expansion of production and consumption leads to human flourishing. The utopians demonstrated the opposite, that deliberate limitation of material desires, combined with equitable distribution of necessary goods, creates abundance that no amount of private accumulation can match. Consider how this applies to contemporary American work culture. You have societies where technological advancement makes workers more productive than ever, yet people work longer hours under greater stress while feeling less security and satisfaction. Why? Because productivity gains serve capital accumulation rather than human flourishing, and because work has been divorced from its proper purpose, contributing to the common good through the exercise of human gifts. The utopians understood work as vocation in the deepest sense, not merely a job or career, but a calling to serve God and neighbor through the development and application of natural talents. Every form of honest labor possessed dignity because it contributed to community life. The farmer who grew food, the craftsman who made tools, the teacher who formed minds, the administrator who coordinated activities, all participated equally in the noble work of sustaining civilization. This vision transforms how we approach economic questions. Instead of asking, how can we create more jobs, the question becomes, how can we organize work so that every person can contribute their gifts while meeting their legitimate needs? Instead of, how can we increase productivity, we ask, how can we ensure that productive capacity serves human flourishing rather than mere accumulation? The practical implications are profound. A society organized around work as vocation would prioritize meaningful employment over maximum profit, would distribute leisure as well as labor, would value care work as highly as commodity production, would measure success by community health rather than aggregate wealth. Such transformation requires recovering the classical understanding that economics serves ethics, not the reverse. The purpose of economic activity is to provide the material foundation for human flourishing, sufficient goods distributed justly so that all can pursue the higher goods of knowledge, friendship, beauty, and service to God. When economic systems become ends in themselves, they inevitably corrupt the human goods they were meant to serve. The utopians achieved this integration by ensuring that those who governed understood themselves as servants rather than masters, that those who labored understood their work as contribution rather than mere survival, that those who taught understood their role as formation rather than mere information transfer. Every station in life became an opportunity for virtue, every form of work a means of loving service. This is why the Christian society we could build must begin with recovering the dignity of work through understanding its proper purpose. Not work as drudgery to be eliminated, nor work as identity to be absolutized, but work as stewardship, the grateful and careful development of creation's gifts for creation's good. Chapter 4, Governance by Virtue, Democracy Requires Character. The utopian political system reveals a truth that modern democracies have largely forgotten. Good government depends more on the character of those who govern than on the structures through which they govern. The utopians chose leaders not through wealth, birth, or even popular appeal, but through demonstrated virtue, wisdom, and commitment to the common good. This selection process began with education that formed citizens capable of recognizing virtue in others. Because utopian society prioritized character formation, the populace could distinguish between authentic leadership and mere ambition, between wisdom and cleverness, between service and self-interest. They understood that democracy functions properly only when citizens possess the virtue necessary to choose virtuous leaders. Your contemporary American political system demonstrates what happens when this foundation erodes. When citizens are formed primarily as consumers rather than moral agents, they approach politics as entertainment rather than responsibility. When leaders are chosen for their ability to promise benefits rather than their capacity for wisdom, governance becomes transaction rather than stewardship. When political discourse rewards polarization rather than prudence, democracy degenerates into competing factions rather than collaborative governance. The utopians avoided these problems through institutional design rooted in moral philosophy. They understood that power corrupts not because authority is inherently evil, but because fallen human nature tends toward pride and self-interest. Therefore, they built checks against corruption not just through structural separation of powers, but through cultural formation that made the abuse of authority shameful rather than enviable. Leaders in Utopia governed for limited terms, lived simply, and remained accountable to those they served. They exercised authority as stewardship rather than ownership, understanding themselves as servants of justice rather than wielders of power. This was possible because utopian society honored virtue more than wealth, service more than status, wisdom more than ambition. Such transformation in contemporary democratic societies would require fundamental changes in how citizens understand both their rights and responsibilities. Rights exist not for individual self-assertion but for human flourishing within community. Responsibilities flow not from external imposition but from internal recognition that we owe our development to others and thus owe contribution in return. The practical implications touch every aspect of political life. Campaign finance would prioritize equal access to democratic participation over protection of unlimited spending. Media coverage would emphasize candidate character and policy substance over sensational controversy. Civic education would focus on forming citizens capable of prudential judgment rather than mere partisan loyalty. Perhaps most importantly, the Christian society we could build would recover the understanding that political authority exists to serve human dignity rather than merely to aggregate preferences. This means governance oriented toward objective standards of justice rather than subjective measures of satisfaction, toward long-term human flourishing rather than short-term political advantage, toward the common good rather than factional interest. The utopians demonstrated that such governance is possible when supported by appropriate cultural formation. They showed that democracy reaches its highest potential not when it maximizes individual freedom from obligation, but when it forms individuals capable of the virtue necessary for authentic self-governance. They proved that political institutions function best when embedded in social practices that form character rather than merely channeling preferences. This requires recovering the classical insight that politics is a branch of ethics, the art of creating conditions under which human beings can flourish together. Good government serves human dignity by establishing justice, maintaining peace, and promoting conditions conducive to virtue. It recognizes that true freedom comes not from absence of restraint but from the capacity to choose rightly, and that authentic equality concerns dignity rather than mere preference satisfaction. Chapter 5: Religious Liberty Through Shared Truth, Unity Without Uniformity. One aspect of utopian society that often surprises readers is its approach to religious diversity. Despite my own deep Catholic commitments, I described a society that welcomed various forms of worship while maintaining social unity through shared commitment to moral truth and civic virtue. This was not relativism but wisdom, the recognition that genuine religious liberty serves both faith and society better than coerced conformity. The utopians understood that forced belief produces hypocrisy rather than virtue, that external compliance without internal conviction weakens rather than strengthens both church and state. They established religious freedom not because they considered all beliefs equally valid, but because they recognized that authentic faith must be freely chosen and that society benefits when individuals follow their informed consciences rather than mere social pressure. This principle offers crucial guidance for contemporary American debates about religious liberty in pluralistic society. The challenge is not how to eliminate religious differences, an impossible and undesirable goal, but how to maintain social unity while respecting legitimate diversity of religious conviction. The utopian model suggests that this requires shared commitment to moral truth that transcends particular religious expressions while supporting their authentic development. In practical terms, This means distinguishing between core moral principles necessary for social life: justice, honesty, care for the vulnerable, respect for human dignity, and particular theological doctrines about which good people may reasonably disagree. Society can and must insist on certain behavioral standards while remaining open to diverse motivations for meeting those standards. The utopians achieved this balance by cultivating what we might call principled pluralism, unity around essential moral truths combined with liberty regarding secondary matters. They understood that social cooperation requires shared values, but that these values can be supported by different philosophical and theological foundations. A Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, and even a thoughtful secular humanist can all affirm human dignity, though they ground this affirmation in different ultimate sources. This approach protects authentic religious liberty by ensuring that faith communities can maintain their distinctive beliefs and practices while participating fully in civic life. It prevents both the sectarian extreme that would impose particular religious doctrines on all citizens and the secularist extreme that would exclude religious voices from public discourse. Instead, it welcomes all sincere contributions to the ongoing conversation about how to build just and flourishing communities. The key insight is that religious liberty serves truth rather than relativism. When people are free to explore ultimate questions without coercion, they are more likely to arrive at authentic conviction. When faith communities must persuade rather than compel, they develop more thoughtful and compelling expressions of their beliefs. When society benefits from diverse perspectives on fundamental questions, it makes wiser decisions about complex moral issues. Contemporary American society could benefit enormously from recovering this utopian wisdom. Instead of treating religious differences as threats to social unity, we could recognize them as resources for deeper understanding of shared human concerns. Instead of trying to eliminate religious voices from public life, we could welcome their contributions while maintaining appropriate boundaries between institutional church and state. This requires formation in what the utopians practiced naturally: the ability to distinguish between essential and secondary matters, the capacity for charitable dialogue with those who disagree, the wisdom to separate institutional roles from personal convictions. Public officials can maintain their religious commitments while serving all citizens fairly. Religious leaders can advocate for their moral convictions while respecting democratic processes. Citizens can bring their deepest beliefs to civic engagement while remaining open to persuasion through reason and evidence. The Christian society we could build would demonstrate that authentic religious liberty strengthens rather than weakens both faith and democracy. It would show that people of different ultimate commitments can cooperate in pursuit of proximate goods, that diversity of religious conviction can contribute to rather than detract from social wisdom, that freedom of conscience serves truth better than any form of coercion. Chapter 6: Economic Justice: Beyond Capitalism and Socialism. The economic system I described in Utopia transcends the conventional categories of capitalism and socialism by focusing on a more fundamental question: how can economic arrangements serve human dignity and community flourishing? The utopians developed principles that offer guidance for contemporary societies struggling with inequality, insecurity, and alienation despite unprecedented material abundance. The first principle is that economic systems exist to serve human needs, not to generate abstract growth or profit. This seems obvious, yet most contemporary economic theory treats human well-being as a byproduct of market efficiency or state planning rather than as the primary goal. The utopians insisted that any economic arrangement must be evaluated by its effects on human flourishing, not just material prosperity, but the full range of goods necessary for a meaningful life. The second principle is that legitimate needs should be distinguished from manufactured desires. The utopians provided abundantly for genuine human necessities: nutritious food, comfortable shelter, adequate clothing, healthcare, education, leisure for intellectual and spiritual development. But they deliberately limited luxury production that served vanity rather than authentic need. This was not asceticism but prudence, the recognition that societies can choose to direct productive capacity toward genuine flourishing rather than competitive consumption. The third principle is that economic participation should be both universal and limited. Every able person contributed to productive work, ensuring that none lived parasitically off others' labor. But no one worked more than necessary for community prosperity, ensuring that economic activity left time for the higher pursuits that give life meaning: family relationships, intellectual development, artistic creation, spiritual growth, civic engagement. These principles challenge both capitalist and socialist orthodoxies while offering practical guidance for economic reform. Against pure capitalism, they insist that markets must serve moral purposes and that some goods, healthcare, education, basic necessities, should not be treated as commodities. Against state socialism, they recognize that central planning cannot substitute for voluntary cooperation and that economic freedom contributes to human dignity. The utopian approach suggests what we might call participatory economics, systems that combine market mechanisms with democratic planning, private initiative with social responsibility, individual freedom with collective wisdom. This might involve worker cooperatives that give employees ownership stakes in their enterprises, community land trusts that remove housing from speculation while maintaining private use, public banks that serve community development rather than profit maximization. Such arrangements already exist in contemporary American society: credit unions, housing cooperatives, employee-owned companies, community-supported agriculture, local investment clubs. The question is whether these alternatives can be scaled and systematized to address systemic problems of inequality and insecurity while preserving the benefits of economic freedom and innovation. The key insight from Utopia is that economic justice requires more than redistribution of wealth. It requires reorganization of productive relationships so that everyone can contribute meaningfully while meeting their legitimate needs. This means creating economic institutions that serve community flourishing rather than merely individual accumulation, that value human development as highly as material production, that treat natural resources as stewardship rather than exploitation. The practical implications are far-reaching. Tax policy would prioritize investment in human development over wealth concentration. Labor law would support worker participation in enterprise governance. Trade policy would protect local communities from destructive global competition. Environmental policy would recognize that economic systems must operate within ecological limits. Financial regulation would direct capital toward productive investment rather than speculative trading. Most fundamentally, the Christian society we could build would recover the understanding that economics is a branch of ethics, a set of practices for organizing material life in service of human dignity and community flourishing. This means moving beyond ideological debates about capitalism versus socialism toward practical questions about which economic arrangements best serve human well-being in particular times and places. The utopians proved that such transformation is possible when supported by appropriate cultural formation and institutional design. They showed that people can choose cooperation over competition, sufficiency over excess, participation over alienation, when social structures support rather than undermine these choices. Chapter 7: The Path Forward: Building Utopia in Real Time. The most common objection to utopian thinking is that it remains forever theoretical, beautiful in imagination but impossible in practice. Yet this misses the essential point of my original work. Utopia was never meant as a complete blueprint but as a lens for examining present arrangements and a direction for gradual reform. The question is not whether we can create perfect society overnight, but whether we can move steadily toward more just and flourishing communities. The path forward begins with what the ancients called practical wisdom, the ability to apply universal principles to particular circumstances. The utopian principles we have explored throughout this discussion are not abstract ideals but practical guidelines that can inform concrete decisions about education, work, governance, religious liberty, and economic arrangements within existing societies. Start with education reform in local communities. Parents and teachers can prioritize character formation alongside academic achievement, can integrate classical learning with practical skills, can form young people for citizenship rather than merely individual success. School boards can adopt curricula that serve human development rather than just economic productivity. Colleges can remember their original purpose as institutions for moral and intellectual formation rather than merely credentialing services. Continue with economic experimentation at appropriate scales. Communities can develop local currencies that keep wealth circulating within neighborhoods. Workers can form cooperatives that give employees ownership stakes in their enterprises. Municipalities can establish public banks that serve community development rather than external shareholders. States can experiment with universal basic services that guarantee essential needs while maintaining incentives for contribution. Extend to political reform that serves virtue rather than mere preference aggregation. Citizens can prioritize character over charisma in candidate selection. Civic organizations can focus on forming people for democratic participation rather than merely mobilizing votes. Communities can experiment with deliberative democracy that brings citizens together for thoughtful discussion of complex issues rather than mere opinion polling. The key insight is that transformation must be both personal and structural, both gradual and persistent. Individuals must cultivate the virtues necessary for just society while working to create institutions that support rather than undermine virtue. Communities must begin where they are with what they have while maintaining vision of where they could be with sustained effort. This requires what I learned during my own struggles with conscience and authority: the courage to live by truth regardless of social pressure, the prudence to choose battles wisely, the hope that persists despite temporary setbacks, the charity that seeks conversion rather than conquest of those who disagree. Building utopia in real time demands the integration of contemplation and action, principle and prudence, idealism and realism. The Christian society we could build will not emerge through revolution but through conversion, the patient work of forming hearts and minds, institutions and practices that serve human dignity and community flourishing. It requires people willing to live differently in the present while working steadily for systemic change, who understand that authentic reform begins with personal transformation but extends to social structures. Contemporary American society possesses unique advantages for this work: constitutional traditions that protect both individual rights and community values, democratic institutions that allow peaceful change through persuasion, economic abundance that could be redirected toward genuine prosperity, educational resources that could form citizens for virtue as well as productivity, religious freedom that allows faith communities to contribute their wisdom to public life. What is needed is not perfect people or ideal circumstances, but sufficient numbers of individuals committed to the gradual work of reform guided by clear vision of human flourishing. The utopians succeeded not because they were saints but because they organized social life around true principles and maintained institutions that supported virtue rather than vice. The path forward requires both urgency and patience. Urgency because present injustices cause real suffering that demands immediate attention. Patience because lasting change requires deep cultural transformation that occurs slowly through sustained effort across generations. We must act as if transformation is possible while accepting that we may not see its completion in our lifetimes. This is the essence of Christian hope applied to social reform, working faithfully for justice while trusting that truth and goodness ultimately prevail when lived courageously by sufficient numbers of people across sufficient time. Conclusion. As I conclude these reflections from my study in Chelsea, I am struck by how little human nature has changed across the centuries. The same desires for security, meaning, and community that motivated the utopians still drive people today. The same tensions between individual ambition and common good still challenge every society. The same fundamental questions about justice, virtue, and human flourishing still await answers. What has changed is our capacity for both creation and destruction, our technological power to build or ruin communities, our global interconnection that makes local decisions reverberate worldwide. This makes utopian thinking more necessary, not less. We need clearer vision of human flourishing to guide choices with such far-reaching consequences. The Christian society we could build remains possible because it rests on unchanging truths about human dignity, because it serves permanent needs of human nature, because it offers hope grounded in divine providence rather than human perfectibility. Begin where you are, with what you have, guided by these principles. Trust that small acts of justice, repeated faithfully across time, can transform the world as surely as streams carve canyons. The utopia we seek is not a destination but a direction, toward communities where every person can flourish in the fullness of their human dignity.